The wind was a living thing, a skeletal hand clawing at the cabin's weathered walls, testing every chink, every desperate patch. Elara drew her shawl tighter, the thin wool offering scant defense against the encroaching cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. Outside, the world was a canvas of unforgiving white. Snow piled high against the window, muffling the already distant sounds of the valley below. Months had passed since the fever had claimed her parents, leaving her alone in this isolated pocket of the mountains, a solitary flicker in the vast, indifferent wilderness. Grief was a lead weight in her chest, but it was the raw, gnawing fear that truly hollowed her out now. Winter was a predator, patient and merciless, and her provisions, once thought adequate, dwindled with alarming speed. Each morning, the light seemed thinner, the promise of spring further away. She was 22, but the hardships had etched lines of worry around her eyes, turning their usual clear blue to a haunted, distant shade. A sudden, sharp rap at the door shattered the cabin's fragile peace. Elara froze, her breath catching. No one came this far up the pass in such weather, not unless her hand instinctively went to the heavy iron poker beside the hearth. Another knock, more insistent this time, accompanied by a faint, desperate cough. Curiosity, or perhaps a deep-seated human need for connection, overruled her fear. She unbarred the door, cautiously, just a crack. A blast of icy air ripped through the opening, carrying with it the scent of pine and desperation. Standing on her porch, half buried in the deepening drifts, were two figures. A man, tall and gaunt, his face a grim mask beneath a wide-brimmed, snow-laden hat, and clutched against his leg, a small girl, no more than 5 or 6, her tiny face pale with cold, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. The man's eyes, dark and shadowed, met hers. They held a weary plea, a silent testament to a journey endured, and a desperate hope for reprieve. "We're lost," the man rasped, his voice raw. "Blizzard caught us. My daughter, she's fading." He gestured weakly to the child, who shivered violently, her small body trembling uncontrollably. Elara's gaze softened, a deep, maternal instinct stirring within her. She knew what a child freezing to death looked like. She'd seen it in the valley settlements before, the way life simply slipped away. Her own loneliness, a constant companion, momentarily receded, replaced by an urgent, undeniable sense of responsibility. This was not a choice. It was an imperative. To deny them entry would be to condemn them. The mountain had taught her harsh lessons about survival, about the thin line between life and death. Compassion sometimes was the only currency left. She pulled the door wider, a silent invitation. "Come in," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She led them to the hearth, urging the man, Cain, as he quietly introduced himself, to shed his heavy, frozen coat. Lily, the child, collapsed onto the bare rug before the fire, her small hands outstretched to the flames, a faint whimper escaping her lips. Elara knelt, chafing the girl's cold hands, pouring her a mug of weak, warm broth. The silence in the cabin was thick with unspoken stories, of loss and struggle, binding them in an unexpected, fragile truce against the encroaching night and the unforgiving world outside. The guilt of turning them away, she knew, would have been a colder, more enduring torment than any present fear. Morning light, pale and hesitant, filtered through the snow-laden window. Elara had spent a fitful night on a makeshift pallet by the hearth, listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of Cain and Lily. The child had slept soundly, curled into her father's side, a small hand clutching his worn coat. Cain, however, had shifted often, a vigilant presence even in slumber. As dawn broke, Elara rose, stirring the embers, setting a pot of what little coffee she had left to brew. The silence was less oppressive now, a shared space rather than an empty void. She glanced at the two figures, a strange mix of apprehension and a nascent, unsettling sense of peace stirring within her. When Cain woke, his dark eyes met hers across the cabin, a flicker of gratitude visible before he hardened his gaze. Lily, roused by the smell of coffee, sat up, rubbing her eyes with a small fist, then offered Alara a shy, tentative smile. It was a fragile thing, that smile, but it felt like a tiny seed planted in the frozen ground of Alara's heart. She offered them their portions of dried venison and hardtack, meager but sustaining. Cain ate slowly, deliberately, his movements economical, his eyes constantly assessing, taking in the cabin, its sparse but meticulously kept contents, and Alara herself. There was a quiet strength about him, an almost primal self-reliance that both unsettled and intrigued her. He was not a man given to idle words, his gratitude conveyed in the way he meticulously helped Lily, or how he quietly helped stack the dwindling firewood. They couldn't stay. Alara knew it and he knew it. Her resources were too thin for three, but the blizzard raged on outside, an unrelenting white wall. Days bled into one another, marked only by the dwindling stores and the deepening drifts. Cain, despite his gaunt frame, proved himself capable, venturing out once the snow lessened enough to chop more wood, always bringing back a small offering a rabbit snared, a handful of dried berries he'd found beneath a snowdrift. Lily, too, began to bloom under Alara's quiet care, her laughter, faint at first, echoing occasionally through the cabin, a sound Alara hadn't heard in years. Then came the knock. Not the desperate plea of Cain and Lily, but the firm, unyielding rap of authority. Old Man Hemlock, the valley's self-appointed elder, stood on the porch, his face grim, flanked by two other stern-faced villagers. His eyes immediately fell upon Cain, then flicked to Lily, nestled securely beside Alara by the fire. A cold dread settled in Alara's stomach. "Alara," Hemlock began, his voice devoid of warmth, "it has come to our attention that you are harboring a man and a child. This is not fitting. Not for a woman alone." His gaze was accusatory, judgmental. "It brings ill repute. And for the child, a lone woman cannot raise a child without a father. It is not decent. Not proper." Cain rose slowly, placing himself subtly between Alara and the doorway, his hand resting lightly on Lily's head. His eyes held a silent challenge. Alara felt a flush rise to her cheeks, a mix of indignation and a chilling understanding. Society's unwritten laws, stricter than any blizzard, were descending upon her. "We heard the man is a widower, lost from a settlement further north," Hemlock continued, his voice lowering, taking on a tone of grim, self-righteous pronouncement. "It is clear what must be done. For the sake of the child's future, for your own good name, and for the order of our community, you must marry him, Alara. By morning." His words hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. To refuse was to invite condemnation, to condemn Lily to a life of shame and Alara to utter ruin, to cast them out into the unforgiving cold, all under the guise of guilt for her supposed impropriety. The choice, if it could be called that, was no choice at all. The decree hung in the air long after the elders had departed, leaving behind a silence heavier than any snowfall. Alara stared at Cain, her mind racing. Anger simmered beneath her fear, anger at the injustice, at the sheer audacity of their pronouncement, at the way her life, her choices, were being dictated by the rigid expectations of a society that had offered her no solace in her grief. Cain stood, impassive, his back to the hearth, his gaze unreadable. Lily, sensing the shift in the cabin's atmosphere, watched them both with wide, uncertain eyes. "They cannot force this," Alara whispered, more to herself than to him. Her voice trembled despite her efforts to steady it. Cain's reply was low, gravelly. "They can. And they will. They'll see it as their right. For the child's sake. For your name." He didn't argue, didn't protest, simply stated the cold, hard truth of their predicament. His acceptance was unsettling. Was he resigned, or did he see some grim advantage? The thought curdled in her stomach. That night, a new storm descended, more savage than the last. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the cabin to its very foundations. Snow fell thick and fast, burying the world in an impenetrable shroud of white. The temperature plummeted, and the cabin, despite the roaring fire, grew dangerously cold. The dwindling firewood was a stark reminder of their precarious situation. It was in the face of this external fury that the unspoken truths began to surface. Alara watched Cain. He worked tirelessly, shoring up weak points in the walls, ensuring the chimney was clear, his movements efficient and quiet. He understood the language of survival, the brutal calculus of the wilderness, in a way she had only begun to grasp. When the fire began to dwindle, the woodpile exhausted, he didn't panic. Instead, he simply looked at her, his eyes conveying a question, a grim determination. She understood. They needed more wood, and quickly. To wait was to invite frostbite, then worse. As the first faint light of dawn attempted to pierce the blizzard's fury, a new sound cut through the howling wind, a low, guttural growl, too close for comfort. A wolf, and then a series of frantic thuds against the cabin wall. It was trying to get in. Lily, still half asleep, whimpered, burying her face in Cain's side. Alara grabbed the iron poker, her heart hammering against her ribs. Cain moved with startling speed, not to the door, but to the small, unbarred window that faced the sound. He smashed a stool against the glass, the shards scattering inward, and thrust a burning log, snatched from the dying embers, into the opening. The snarl grew louder, then abruptly cut off, replaced by a yelp and the sound of retreating paws crunching in the deep snow. He stood there, chest heaving, the cold air rushing in through the broken pane, his face grim, eyes scanning the white out. He had protected them, without a word, without a moment's hesitation. He hadn't sought glory, merely acted, decisively and instinctively. In that moment, a flicker of something new ignited within Alara. Not trust, not yet, but a raw, undeniable respect. He was not a burden. He was a force. As he began, quietly, to board up the broken window, using pieces of spare wood and torn blankets, she found herself not watching him with suspicion, but with a different kind of understanding. The Elder's decree, once a weight of shame and an imposition of guilt, now seemed different. Perhaps, in this desolate land, in this desperate time, partnership wasn't a choice, but a necessity. And perhaps with him it might not be a prison, but a path to a survival she couldn't achieve alone. The blizzard lifted as abruptly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world transformed, sharp and clean under a sky of impossibly clear blue. The air still held a bite, but the sun, a rare and welcome visitor, promised a thawing however slow. Inside the cabin, the shattered window was a crude patch of patched-up wood and canvas, a stark reminder of the night's terror and Cain's swift action. The shared ordeal had stripped away the last vestiges of polite pretense, leaving behind a raw, unspoken understanding. The morning of the wedding dawned bright, yet solemn. There was no joy, no celebration. Old Man Hemlock returned, accompanied by the circuit preacher, their faces unyielding. The cabin felt too small, too filled with the weight of expectation. Alara wore her mother's simple, worn dress. Its once vibrant blue faded to a soft gray. Her hair, usually unbound, was braided tightly, a conscious choice to convey dignity in the face of what felt like a surrender. Cain stood opposite her, his face a mask, his dark eyes meeting hers only briefly, a flash of something unreadable, perhaps a mirrored resignation, perhaps something more. The vows were sparse, the words echoing oddly in the small space, binding them in a covenant neither had sought. Do you, Alara, take this man, Cain, to be your lawfully wedded husband? The preacher's voice was flat, formal. Alara's gaze flickered to Lily, who stood clutching Cain's leg, her small face solemn, her wide eyes fixed on Alara. It was for Lily, Alara realized, not just for the sake of her own reputation, that she uttered the word. I do. It was a whisper, yet firm. Cain's I do was a low rumble, devoid of inflection. The small, hurried ceremony concluded, and the elders departed, their mission accomplished, leaving behind a silence even heavier than before. They were husband and wife. The words felt alien, a costume she had been forced to wear. Yet, as the days bled into weeks, and the last stubborn snowdrifts began to recede, a different truth began to emerge. Cain was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He repaired the cabin's roof, secured the shutters, and began to lay traps for game. He was a provider, a protector, his quiet strength a comforting anchor in the unpredictable wilderness. He never presumed, never demanded. He simply was. He worked from dawn till dusk, always with an eye to Lily, teaching her the names of the birds, how to identify animal tracks, how to make a whistle from a hollow reed. And Alara, in turn, began to see him not as a trespasser, but as a partner. Her own resilience, dulled by grief and isolation, began to rekindle. She found new purpose in managing their meager stores, in mending their clothes, in teaching Lily to read from her mother's worn Bible. The guilt that had propelled her into this union had dissolved, replaced by a quiet, burgeoning respect and a deep, unexpected sense of belonging. Their marriage was not born of love's tender bloom, but of the harsh soil of necessity, forged in the crucible of survival. Yet, within its unromantic confines, a different kind of warmth grew. One evening, as twilight painted the peaks in shades of violet and gold, Cain sat by the hearth, whittling a small wooden bird for Lily. Alara watched him, a familiar feeling of peace settling over her. He looked up, catching her eye. A flicker of something, softer than usual, passed between them. It was not passion, but quiet acceptance, a shared understanding of burdens and small triumphs. The cabin, once a lonely sanctuary, now felt like a home, resilient and strong, its walls not just protecting them from the world, but holding them together, two solitary souls forging a future, not out of obligation, but out of a hard-won, unspoken partnership. Their survival, Alara knew, was no longer a solitary burden, but a shared journey, etched in the very landscape they had learned to brave together.